It starts with
one thing, I don't know why. It doesn't even matter how hard you try. Keep that in mind. I designed this rhyme to explain in due time. All I know, time is a valuable thing.
This is
Cringe.
What is
Cringe.
How do you define
Cringe.
Cringe at the moment is loosely defined. Depending on who you talk to, different people will find different things to be cringe. In her video on the subject, Natalie Wynn, aka ContraPoints, makes a throwaway line and says, "Cringe is failed seriousness." In a way, this is true. We cringe when we see someone earnestly expressing their individual personhood in a way that we do not accept, instead reframing our reaction to be that of both ridicule and disgust. To some, this may be transgender furry cat girls, to others this might be Funko Pop obsessed neuroatypical men, and still others may find cringe at so-called social justice warriors fighting for their beliefs in obnoxious ways. According to Merriam-Webster, to cringe is to recoil in distaste. While we can see this in the modern definitions of cringe, there is a distinct physical reaction that comes with looking at images, reading text, or watching videos that are cringe. Cringe itself has since transcended this simple noun and verb definition to become an adjective. No longer do we simply cringe at things, but things are cringe. They embody everything that we find embarrassing in the world today. The cringe among us must be eliminated. Perhaps the most useful definition I've found for cringe comes from Claire C.H.'s article titled, "This is Pretty Cringe," where she states that an increasing number of English speakers began using cringe to describe the pathos of coming across anyone who still had any hope left. I think that this definition describes cringe's usage in the modern day in the most apt way. As our internet presence becomes increasingly managed by ironic distance, anything posted without a cynical disposition becomes something for the ironic majority to cringe at, to ruthlessly mock for not relating to their already melancholic disposition. But there's obviously a problem with this. If we see hope as cringy, how can we be expected to make any change? To quote from the Xenofeminist Manifesto, "Melancholy, so endemic to the left, teaches us that emancipation is an extinct species to be wept over, and that blips of negation are the best we can hope for." At its worst, such an attitude generates nothing but political lassitude, and at its best, installs an atmosphere of pervasive despair which too often degenerates into factionalism and petty moralizing. The malady of melancholia only compounds political inertia, and, under the guise of being realistic, relinquishes all hope of calibrating the world otherwise. Looking at this quote, we can see the general problems with this attitude in regards to political discourse. This despair and consequent shift towards irony as a defensive mechanism for this despair constitutes something of a holding pattern. Rather than attempting to change anything or to live lives in which hope for the future is something that they genuinely believe in, these melancholic agents instead deride those that think this way, claiming it unrealistic. This is an attitude that voraciously defends the status quo, and keeps us living within capitalist realism, which Mark Fisher describes as the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also it is now impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. To further define cringe, I would like to look at it as the synthesis between abjection, as defined by Julia Kristeva in Powers of Horror, and people with separatist tendencies, as defined by Henri Bergson in Laughter. For this forms the core of cringe. Not only is it simply ridicule and humor, but also of resentment and horror. We cringe not only because we find something funny, but because we also find it unnerving. A social awkwardness that causes a break within our reality tunnel and forces us to reckon with the other. I'll first tackle Bergson, who writes about the individual with separatist tendencies by stating, "Society will therefore be suspicious of all inelasticity of character, of mind, and even of body, because it is the possible sign of a slumbering activity as well as of an activity with separatist tendencies, that inclines to swerve from the common center round which society gravitates. In short, because it is a sign of an eccentricity. And yet, society cannot intervene at this stage by material repression, since it is not affected in a material fashion. It is confronted with something that makes it uneasy, but only as a symptom, scarcely a threat, at the very most a gesture. A gesture, therefore, will be its reply. Laughter must be something of this kind, a sort of social gesture." Bergson here focuses on elasticity of an individual, the willingness to go against society's expectations. Bergson states earlier that society relies on the individual to have a balance between elasticity and tension, and when one is lacking in either of these things, it can be viewed as a sickness, a failure of the individual to conform to society's standards. Even though this break from normal society does not functionally destroy our society, it does still force a reaction from us. For Bergson at the time he was writing, this would be laughter. In modern times, this reaction is cringe. This definition from Bergson is supplemented well from Kristeva, who writes that, "It is thus not lack of cleanliness or health that causes abjection, but what disturbs identity, system, and order. What does not respect borders, positions, rules. The in-between, the ambiguous, the composite." The abject is representative of those radically cast off from society, the ones that disturb the constructed social order. For Kristeva, this radically collapses meaning and functions as a way to dissolve ego and superego through the radical protest against them. To quote Kristeva again, it lies outside, beyond the set, and does not seem to agree with the superego's rules of the game. And yet, from its place of banishment, the abject does not cease challenging its master. In her writing, Kristeva argues that this abject force may be disgusting to us. She uses the metaphor of rotting food to help describe what the abject feels like, in a similar way to the horror we feel with the cringe. It unsettles our view of the world around us, and thus we cast it aside.
Sega has got a freaking Sonic Adventure 3 in development with freaking Sonic Team, cause you freaking fricks just can't ever be quenched. Your fantasies can't ever be quenched, can they? You freaking fricks! What will you learn? What will you learn? That your actions have consequences!
To return to Natalie Wynn's video on cringe, she makes a list of people commonly referred to as cringe.
I'd like to share with you a list that I put together of groups that are often considered to be cringe. Bronies, furries, otaku, weebs, incels, neckbeards, fedora tippers, gamers, TikTok teens, not like other girls, fanfic writers, speed poets, SJWs, feminists, MAGAs, trans people, non-binary people, trans trenders, queer AFAB ukulele players, autistic people, fat people, the mentally ill, and the mentally disabled.
If we look at this list, we can find some distinct commonalities between them all, as she does in her video. But the most important commonalities is simply that all of these identity categories fall outside what our culture deems acceptable. These range across political and apolitical, right and left, and men and women. But what I want to focus on is the figure of the cringe trans woman and how it relates to my own struggles with gender identity. In high school, I began to think more critically about my own gender identity, calling into question my own construction of who I thought I really was. While I knew I no longer identified with my assigned sex, the question of what I did identify as remained up in the air. This was around 2014-2015, the time associated with the famous Time magazine cover which loudly proclaimed the transgender tipping point. While this tipping point referred to the growing acceptance and visibility of trans people, as we know, this heightened visibility also comes with intense scrutiny. This time period also saw proliferation of transgender cringe compilations. Videos uploaded to YouTube consisting of several clips of transgender people taken out of context and edited together to create a video that would be hard to watch for someone who may have a disdain towards this particular identity group. While the videos would sometimes feature videos of transgender people making themselves obnoxious, screaming at others for not respecting their pronouns and other such things, the majority of the videos here just displayed people living their lives. A collection of clips taken from Tumblr of people trying to figure out their own gender identity in ways that don't necessarily fit societal norms. For a high schooler like me to watch these videos, it made it seem like any experimentation outside of the norm would be grounds to be added to a compilation like this. As such, I was forced to hide my feelings, not able to truly accept what I really felt. I then experimented with other labels in the future, but my outward appearance never strayed far from what was expected of me as a man in our society. I was younger then. I wanted to be cool. If I did not pass, if I could not go stealth, I would be cringe. And if I was cringe, I would be worthless. So I hid myself, and did my best to cringe with the rest of my peers at young people using neo-pronouns, accepting themselves outside of the gender binary, and being happy to finally feel connected to a gender they felt was right. Their hope caused my cringe. In their article, Other Trans People Make Me Dysphoric, Trans Assimilation and Cringe, Charlie Markbrighter writes that, because we live in a society, we are rewarded for choosing individualism over solidarity with the very people who, because of cringe's identificatory structure, we have the most in common with. We are rewarded for punishing people for failing to meet social norms, and the reward is assimilation. This quote proves incredibly illustrative of my own thought patterns in the time before I identified the way I do today. I could not see myself within the transgender community. The few trans women I had met at the time had niche interests and could be annoying. I thought of them as cringe because I myself would never sink so low to embarrass myself the way that they were. Rather than trying to find the commonality between our shared experiences of dysphoria, even if for the most part I was suppressing my own, I instead lashed out and found them to be cringe. Among others, mostly cis people, I would make fun of trans people I saw online, and my only reward would not be the ability to be myself, but instead being willingly accepted into normal society. If you go on 4chan now, it's impossible not to find countless threads on any board in which tranny is the insult of choice. Governmental officials in a steadily increasing number of states draw up legislation to force trans people underground. While it may be stretched to indict cringe culture as the reason for these things, I don't think it's a stretch to say that it definitely contributed to the growing resentment felt towards trans people. I realized about a year ago that these feelings of cringe were impeding me from being able to live the life I wanted to live. That if any trans person can be put in one of these cringe compilations, I may as well stop fearing the cringe and embrace myself as a cringe actor. Furthermore, why should we stop at the more normal people featured in these compilations? The cringe that they represent is about loudly asserting our right to exist. If a non-conforming trans person is loudly asserting their own gender and or pronouns in an obnoxious way, why is it that we cringe at them for breaking a hole in our society's gendered expectations? Should the cringe itself not be directed towards the society that forces the individual to have to assert their personhood? In Trans Generations, Jack Halberstam writes, as trans activists say about prison, it is not about finding space in the prison that is appropriate for trans bodies. We should instead be using the occasion of the crisis initiated by the trans body to question the practice of caging humans in the first place. In other words, there is no right cage. I think though that Halberstam's ideas can be pushed further from here, using the concept of cringe. If cringe itself is indicative of a reaction to those at the margins of society, we should be using the reality-breaking reaction to question the very structures surrounding the person we are cringing at. Why is it that we cringe at the mentally ill, or the differently abled, or the queer? It is not the individual that is cringe in society, but the society that makes them cringe. The term cringe accelerationism was coined by satirical political YouTuber Dreg in a video titled Post-Cringe, Faux Cringe, and Cringe Accelerationism. He states,
I, my friends, am a cringe accelerationist. I believe that the only way to achieve the inevitable post-cringe utopia is for everybody to act as cringeworthy as possible at all times, destroying the social bonds of cringe.
While the video itself is tongue-in-cheek, and I tend not to agree with some of the other work he does, I think Dreg's ideas here can be taken seriously and expanded upon. By embracing the cringe within the individual and accepting the cringe within others, we can further move towards a post-cringe world. Cringe provides a necessary break from our narrow reality tunnels and forces us to reckon with those that don't fit into our own presuppositions of how people should behave. As such, if each of us were to embrace our inner cringe, this can force the reaction upon others. And as each person does this, it forces more people to reckon with what they find to be cringe and why they do so. I want to look towards Ryan Trecarton's film IB Area as something as a basis for a cringe accelerationist text. The film itself is an experimental narrative focusing on a variety of avatars inhabiting a virtual world. This much is not necessarily spelled out within the film. Instead, we are simply privy to a collection of people in weird makeup and avant-garde clothing speaking non-sequiturs at each other for almost 2 hours. Thematically, the film portrays the virtual world as an identity hypershredder. Characters in the film will constantly shift identities, performers will play multiple different characters at once, and most importantly, nothing in terms of identity is really tied physically to any of the performers. This calls back to Kristeva and the use of objection to collapse meaning and dissolve the ego/superego. Through the acceleration of the virtual world, there can no longer be distinctive difference between individuals outside of personal choice. As such, the film portrays a world in which cringe is the norm, and every character is constantly showing themselves in the highest energy way that they can.
Psych! I never ever go to sleep, which makes me twice my age. Give me props!
The film intersects with this cringe accelerationist framework primarily through its presentation. Watching the film feels like a cacophony. The film overstimulates the viewer by constantly introducing new characters, abstract settings, and its grimy early digital camera work. Furthermore, the film has characters talking and screaming at the camera, assaulting the viewer head-on with its earnest and hyper energy. It draws comparisons to the work of early YouTube pioneers like Fred or Smosh, whose hyper-energetic presentation won over many of those early internet viewers, but can now seem incredibly cringe in comparison to the more relaxed presentation of internet creators today. IB Area uses the same technique as an assault on the viewer, constantly antagonizing the audience through its own anarchic energy. This antagonistic view of the audience can also be felt in another work of proto-cringe accelerationism, Damon Packard's Reflections of Evil. IMDb describes the film as being about Julie, who died of a PCP overdose as a teen in the early 70s, searching from beyond the ethers for her little brother Bob, an obese watch seller who is dying of sucrose intolerance in the early 90s. Though this description too is quite misleading. Like IB Area, the film is shot on early digital cameras, providing the film with a dirty look in sun-bleached Los Angeles. What's more formally cringe is the way the film approaches its sound design. All the sound is added in post-production, dubbed over the image by voice actors. But rather than eliminating the peaks of the recording which distort the sound, instead the film embraces the amateurish quality. Almost every sound recording peaks, piercing the viewer's ears and forcing them to pay attention as Damon Packard's character of Bob screams at people indiscriminately on the street. The film's content focuses on the margins of our society. Packard's Bob is a poor, overweight street watch salesman who experiences schizophrenic delusions. These delusions are represented by amateurish horror film clips taken from Packard's previous work, and they force Bob into a constant state of anxiety and delirium. The film shows him walking through the streets of LA as he attempts to sell these watches to people passing by, real LA residents that Packard's fictional character is interacting with. When he doesn't make a sale, he screams profanity on the street, drawing attention to himself and forcing those around him to cringe. This cringe character is someone cast off from normal society, but throughout the film's over 2-hour runtime we eventually find a kinship with him. In many ways, the film forces us to reckon with the cringe and find acceptance for them, even with all the things we may find obnoxious. The final cringe accelerationist text I want to look at is the musical genre of hyperpop, and more specifically Violet Pony's 2021 album, Cutie Marks and the Things That Bind Us. The hyperpop genre is a musical genre descended from trans electronic music producer Sophie and the label PC Music, but exploded into popularity with the release of the 100 gecs album 1000 gecs. Its musical aesthetic focuses on hyper-acceleration of pop music sensibilities with overlap from avant-garde electronica, vaporwave, hip-hop, and other genres. In his article for The Atlantic, Noisy, Ugly, and Addictive, Spencer Kornhaber writes that 1000 gecs is a prankish postmodern collage of Skrillex, Mariah Carey, Blink-182, Nelly, Linkin Park, Kenny Loggins, Eurodance, and ska. What glues together such clashing influences isn't just a sense of musicality, though Brady and Les are excellent songwriters, but a fascination with amusicality. This fascination with amusicality permeates Violet Pony's record, which combines a range of different genres to create atonal but still danceable and energetic cringe anthems. Furthermore, the album embraces the brony subculture, an obsession with the television show My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic, which was once omnipresent online but is now seen as incredibly embarrassing. The album references this both by having samples from the show itself, but also by changing lines within the lyrics, such as changing everybody to every pony, or hands into hooves. This, in conjunction with the overwhelming and overstimulating sounds of the production, position it as a perfect work of modern cringe accelerationism. Every part of the recording embracing cringe ideas and turning them into an earnest expression of self.
Right when he starts firing to try to back boost me, the double. Body armor. 2 quick ones. I already know I'm getting there on the perfect line. Look at the fucking pace! 50, 49, well, 47, baby! That's fucking right! That's fucking it! Fucking pumped watching this one again. I waited to cinema too because I said, oh my god, it might be 112. And it fucking is! It fucking is, baby! Yeah!
In these works, we can see the possibility for change within our society by further accepting of the marginalia. While this can be in small ways, such as just accepting niche interests that individuals may have, this expands outwards into being able to break down our barriers between in-groups and out-groups, to allow for further acceptance of those that are normally excluded from conversations and are denigrated by our social structures. To paraphrase a very famous quote, "Outsiders of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your cringe."
Right. Kinda cringe.